Hi, everyone. This is part two of three of our lecture on the global economy. This is going to be a shorter segment of this lecture. As you recall from the first lecture, we had these three topics to cover. In the first segment, I talked about economy, society, and culture. In this segment, I will be talking about the global economy in history, and I'll focus more specifically on one example of anthropology of globalization or global economy by an anthropologist. And then in the next segment, I will talk a little bit more about the anthropology of global capitalism in the contemporary world. So anthropologists have been studying capitalism, market exchange. If you recall from the first segment of this lecture, we talked about different kinds of economies and economic systems. We talked about gift exchange, redistribution, and then market exchange is the next one that we're going to talk about. And in some ways, it may seem overwhelming to talk about market exchange and capitalism in an anthropological way because it is such a huge topic and because other disciplines tackle this topic as well. So what I want to emphasize in this next two segments is how anthropologists bring a unique approach to the study of capitalism. So here I've collected three covers from three books that I personally like that are anthropologists ethnographies of capitalism, and they take a very different approach, but it kind of gives you a sense of how you can do an ethnography of capitalism. The first cover to your left, it's one by Sweetness. It's the book Sweetness and Power. It's an older one in the 70s, a classic in anthropology. I will talk about this in more length, but basically what this book does is studies a sort of the commodity chain of sugar in the colonial time. So it's not contemporary, but it's still pretty applicable to contemporary commodity chains around the world. The second book, the second cover, the middle one, is an ethnography. It's a more recent one, and it's called Out of the Pits, Traders and Technology from Chicago to London by anthropologist Kate Lindsay Loom. And what she did for this ethnography, she did actually a very classic ethnography. She spent long time doing participant observation at trading pits. And now this seems a little bit obsolete because now a lot of the trading, most of the trading is done digitally. But up until the early 2000s, trading was done just like you see it in this cover. The image there of traders in the floor with pieces of paper, shouting at each other and communicating, doing their trades through verbal communication, using verbal communication. And her unique approach to the study of trading in these sites was to look at the comportment, the bodily behaviors, the kind of masculinity, right? So gender was really important in her study, and what kind of masculinity was promoted as being necessary for being a successful trader. And it's interesting, the study also observed that shifts from the in-person trading to digital trading, and showed how that was not just a shift in technology, but also entailed a shift in the forms of the self, in the comportment, in the forms of interactions that people have on the trading floor. Now, when we think about trading, and of course, nowadays you hear all this news, and I hope this lecture actually makes you think more critically about what's going on with the economy right now. But you hear a lot about the trading and the stock market going down. And mostly when you hear about it in the media, you're only thinking about the numbers, and it's only a numbers game. But reading this ethnography makes us realize that actually these are humans that are doing these trades. And there's a lot of sort of social and cultural aspects to economy at different scales, right? Not only in a sort of farmer's market, but even in the stock trading. These personal social norms are really important for understanding how these institutions work. The final example is the book, The Human Economy, which is an edited volume by three authors, but one of them, the leading author, Keith Hart, is sort of contemporary, very famous anthropologist of the economy and economic anthropology. And in this book, they bring together chapters by different people, different anthropologists doing work in different sites around the world and looking at what they call a human economy, right? And trying to think about the economy once again as in a more humanized way, and understanding that economy is always already intertwined with human systems, with cultural systems, and that you can't separate it and make it just about the numbers, right? So what the Human Economy book looks at are economies that are sort of at the margin. So it's very opposite to the middle book, to Out of the Pits, in that way. But you can see through these three books capture the wide range of possibilities within economic anthropology for how to study the economy and how to study markets. And on that note, I'm actually this semester, in addition to teaching the intro class for you guys, I'm also teaching ethnographies of capitalism. So in our university, in our program, I'm an economic anthropologist by training, and I teach a number of classes that relate to how do we do anthropology of capitalism, how do we do anthropology of markets. Okay, so I'm going to start talking a little bit more about this question, right? So how do anthropologists analyze the global economy? And I'm going to do this by taking on the example of this book, Sweetness and Power. This is, like I said, a classic in anthropology by anthropologist Sidney Mintz, who passed away only a few years ago. Sidney Mintz did his own research in the Caribbean, in Puerto Rico and Jamaica. And in this book, and so he was concerned with questions of economy, of capitalism, but also of slavery and plantation economy in those regions, right? The Sweetness and Power, it was a groundbreaking book. It actually combined anthropological and historical methods to do a study in the history of sugar. Okay, now sugar is a commodity that we take for granted. It's a commodity that we use a lot. Pretty much all foods in the United States, especially processed foods, have sugar. And it's not just desserts, right? But we have sodas, the drinks, even bread, which you don't think of it as a sweet item, right? You think of it as a savory food, has sugar. Even things like meat, you know, we usually cook meat with barbecue sauce, right? Or we eat fries with ketchup, and those added things, those sauces have a lot of sugar. And of course, we know we have an obesity problem that's related to it, and so on and so forth. Now, what Sidney Mintz started with, it's a really good anthropological question that was at the heart of this book. So he noticed in his historical work that sugar was actually not such a ubiquitous commodity in the world, and especially in Britain, where he did part of the study where sugar first became a mass commodity. But he noticed that this sugar was not a mass commodity prior to the 16th century. In fact, at some point in the early 16th century, sugar was considered like a spice, just like cardamom. Now, how many of you have a bottle of cardamom in your drawer? I bet not many. And if you do have a bottle of cardamom or a container of cardamom, it would be like this. I have one. It's this size in my cupboard, and it's halfway full. And I've bought it maybe 2 or 3 years ago, right? So I'm not using it as much. That's the point of me telling this. It's something that I rarely use, just to spice up certain things. Now you have to imagine that 4 or 5 centuries ago, sugar was like that for the European consumer, right? It was not something that was consumed en masse. It was considered a spice. It was considered also a luxury. Only the elites, the aristocracy, could afford to buy spices and had access to spices through spice trade from the East. So Sidney Min's question starts from this observation and says, how did something that was a spice become such a ubiquitous commodity, and how did it come to be so that we consume it so much and we also take it for granted now? We think it's a necessity of our diet. What the short answer, now I will lay this out in different parts, but the short answer for him was that the development of sugar from spice to a mass-produced commodity is very much interlinked with the story of capitalism in Europe. So this was a time of the Industrial Revolution and changes, not only in the economy, but also in the ways of life, right? Of increasing number of what we call the working class. But, and this was sort of his added thing to this story, this transformation was also very much connected with the plantation economy, the colonization of the Americas, and the slave trade from Africa to the Caribbean, and the formation of plantations as a unit, as an economic unit of production. And so now this was actually a groundbreaking conclusion, because it actually challenged some of the main histories of capitalism that were sort of mainstream at the time. And these histories of capitalism usually focus on the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine, and the changes in Europe, and leave out the colonies, colonization, the slave trade. And what Sidney Mintz is trying to propose in this book is that we cannot understand the triumph of capitalism in Europe without understanding the role that the colonies played in producing this raw goods, mass commodities that were then shipped to Europe and refined or manufactured in the case of textiles. I highly recommend reading this book. If you want to know more about it, you should take my 4,000 level class that I'm teaching right now on ethnography of global capitalism. But what I want to emphasize here in terms of sort of what this book did in the history of anthropology and the anthropology of global economy. First of all, this was an historical ethnography, which means it was an ethnography that was based on historical accounts, and it used historical data, it used archives to reconstruct the story, right, of the transformation of sugar. And importantly, this changed some things within anthropology itself. Up until this point, anthropologists were going to a place, to an island or a small community or tribe, and focused only on that moment and leaving history out, freezing people sort of in time, and not understanding or not taking into consideration that even the most isolated communities had been part of bigger historical movements. Another important thing that this ethnography does that has become more common and is replicated in other ethnographies is that it follows a commodity chain. Now, you are probably hearing a lot about commodity chains right now on the media, as this whole coronavirus crisis is throwing not only our health into crisis, but most importantly is throwing the whole capitalist economy into crisis. And one of the things you hear about commodity chains, what is a commodity chain? Okay, a commodity chain is not just like commodities just moving around by themselves, right? There's people in every part of this chain that are doing something, that facilitate something. So a commodity chain, so right now I went to CVS on on Court Street. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. I'm going to CVS, asking for a mask. I knew they were not going to have any masks, but I still, might as well ask. And they said, well, we've sort of been waiting for weeks for masks, but masks are coming from China. That's where they're produced, and they've really been stopping export for a while because they were trying to keep them for themselves, right? And that's an example of a commodity chain. Masks produced in China. Why in China? And we'll talk about more about this more because it's cheaper labor and really extremely high production economy for the last 20, 30 years. And so they're produced there, even by companies that may be American owned, but they do what we call outsourcing of labor. They're produced there, and then they're distributed through an international distribution system, and they come to the retailers here, and they're sold by our retailers, okay? So that's an example of a commodity chain, similar with textiles, right? Our clothes, all of our clothes are produced abroad, and this is another part of commodity chain. So what's been happening, and this is why what you are hearing about in the news, and unfortunately you're going to hear more about this, is that the commodity chains have been disrupted. The people who are producing these masks in China were sick. Their factories closed down. They were in total lockdown for 2 months. So that means no production. And it's not just about the masks, which are now a gold, right? They're a really highly priced commodity, but other things as well. So you will see the same kinds of disruptions and missing things on the grocery store or the supermarket because of this disruption of the commodity chains. And as this stupid virus moves all around the world and affects masses of people, places like factories in particular are extremely vulnerable because of their sort of the close proximity of workers, lack of any, very good sanitation practices, or other kind of standards. We will see that more of these factories will be closed and more of our commodity chains will be affected. Now back to sugar. Basically, the commodity chain that Sydney Mintz followed was how sugar was produced. First of all, when was sugar first used, before it became a mass commodity, but then especially how it became part of this plantation economy in the Caribbean. And so he talks about these 3 different sites. He talks about how slaves were brought into the Caribbean islands to work in the plantations, how plantations developed this very sophisticated system of producing sugar out of sugarcane, and then sugar was being sold in the markets of England. British companies had a monopoly. They were ensured that they would have a monopoly over the British market, and so on and so forth. So basically, but what this did as an ethnography is that it gave this really good example of how you could study, instead of focusing on one community, you could actually focus on one commodity or one object. In this case, this was sugar, and try to understand by following its travel around the world, you would allow you to understand how these communities are dependent on each other. They're interdependent, even though they don't live close by. They're not face-to-face communities, but they're still interdependent. So once again, if you think about this in the contemporary world today, our lives we're learning right now are very much interdependent with the lives of communities in different parts of the world that we are not in proximity to us, but they're still very important to our lives. And so the next sort of innovative thing that this book did was to really change the field of anthropology and anthropological method from doing research in one place, one site, small community, which is like the typical, the old classic model, to shifting into what's called multi-sited research, right? So doing research in different sites to understand a phenomenon that's global, that's not just local. And so Sydney Mintz and a number of other anthropologists at his time basically had to challenge some of these mantras of anthropology at the time about what you can do as an anthropologist, what is anthropological research. He actually conducted very extensive research in particular sites, but he also, and him and his colleagues at the time, advocated for multi-sited ethnography, especially if you wanted to understand global capitalism and global economy. Another thing that this book does, which I think is brilliant, and it's very hard to do, not everyone does it so well, let's say, is that it shows so well the interconnections between economy, society, and culture. So it shows how the changes in economy actually changed social communities and social norms. It also changed cultures. So for instance, one chapter which talks about consumption focuses on the changing cultural norms in Britain through the course of the Industrial Revolution, and especially the changes of culture for the working class, for instance. And then finally, the other important point from this book is to put the history of capitalism and global economy into a sort of broader historical perspective and a broader cultural perspective, and think about it beyond Europe and try to understand how these other processes, such as colonization in this case, and the plantation economy in the colonies, were intertwined with the history of capitalism. So I mentioned the slave trade and the triangle trade. So Sidney Mint's work draws upon the work of Karl Marx, who wrote about capitalism. And one of the things that Marx helped us to think about is to sort of think about capitalism in these three aspects: production, distribution, and consumption. And so Sidney Mintz, in his ethnography, does this thing. He shows how sugar is produced, how it was distributed, and then how it was consumed. So in the production and distribution aspects of sugar, Mintz emphasized things like the slave trade, the triangle trade between Britain, West Africa, and the colonies in the Caribbean islands. He talked about the importance of slave trade in building up this economy of plantation economy that enabled sugar to be produced in a mass quantity. And one thing to note is that sugar is actually not it's not like tomatoes, okay, that you just plant some seeds and it will just grow by itself. Like, it's actually a very high maintenance type of commodity. It doesn't just grow as it is, right? You have to process it. And so that process of processing took place in the plantations. And then some of the other things that were important in thinking about production and distribution were policies such as protectionist policies by the British Crown at the time, which on the one hand, it helped British businesses that set up shop in these colonies. It helped them by extending credit, but also by not allowing other competitors to compete with them in the British market. So it sort of gives us a sense of how to understand, how one commodity becomes massively used. There was all these other aspects that coordinated together that made that possible. And then the other aspect that Mintz focused on was consumption. And he showed how, like I mentioned earlier, sugar was not a mass-consumed product before the slave trade. It became a mass-consumed commodity because of a number of things, but two main things. There was a lot of profit to be made. So because sugar was produced in plantations, and plantations were manned by slaves who were not being paid wages, so this was sort of cheap labor, right? This was the version of cheap labor then, and the version of cheap labor today is outsourcing and these manufacturing plants in countries that have lower labor standards. So because of that, it made sugar profitable. Before that, it wasn't profitable because, like I said, it's a very highly intensive commodity to be produced. So that was one of the reasons why sugar became mass produced. And then the second reason was more cultural, right? So he goes into the study of consumption patterns in Britain. And he claims that sugar became so massively popular because it had the symbolic meaning of class. As I mentioned earlier, before the Industrial Revolution, sugar was used as a spice. It was only accessible by elites, by aristocrats. And here's an image of some art that was made with sugar by the aristocracy of England at the time. These are cakes of different shapes and forms that are made entirely with sugar. Sugar was used as sort of decorative material because it was considered as such a sort of a rare commodity. And for when sugar became cheaper to produce and easier to and massively available, says Mintz, the working classes sort of were able to now use it in tea. This is how sugar was first introduced in the British diet. And they had these small, short tea breaks in an otherwise really long working day. This was a time before sort of 9 to 5 type of working hour days. This was a time of 12-hour workday or 9-hour workday, and very little breaks. And one of the things that was allowed was having these tea breaks. And sugar was used as sort of stimulant to give energy, but it was also, like I said, it also had this symbolic meaning of class. So working class Brits could feel like they were consuming the same thing as the aristocracy did, and this sort of cultural symbolism helped them feel better about themselves. It's a complicated argument, but it's important because a lot of its aspects are very much applicable to relations of production, distribution, and consumption today. So you think about, the allure of the iPhone. And for people who can't afford it, it's a sort of a status symbol, right? So a lot of people consume these things like the iPhone as a way to make them feel like they're part of middle class or upper middle class or global middle class. So some of these aspects, like I said, are very much useful for anthropologists today to think about other forms of economies that we live in. Okay, so just to do a quick wrap up, some takeaways from this this segment. Number one, the global economy has a long history that dates way before the history of capitalism. I didn't touch on this here, but I encourage you to read the textbook, which talks about sort of earlier examples of global trade, such as the Silk Road and so on and so forth. In anthropology, anthropologists have started looking at the global economy pretty late. They've looked at global economy as an object of analysis in the 60s with the work of people like Cindy Mintz, who looked at how different places and cultures are linked through commodity chains and commodity production. Another takeaway point is that doing an anthropology of the global economy entails multi-sided research, right? So there's a transformation of the very methods that anthropologists use. And then a final takeaway point in terms of what anthropologists bring into the table to the study of the economy is that they look at production, consumption, and redistribution patterns on a global scale, focusing on how these patterns affect local economies and cultures. So this is it for this segment, and I'm going to move to the third segment that I will record separately.